Hello, my name is Marnie and I'd like to welcome you to Frankston City Library's FrankTALK with debut author Betty O'Neill. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which Frankston City Libraries operates, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I would also like to extend that respect to the elders of other communities who may be joining us today. Betty O'Neill is a Sydney-based writer and teacher with a lively curiosity and a passion for learning. She has an eclectic range of degrees, including the most recent in 2018, a Doctorate of Creative Arts, and is a university lecturer in creative intelligence and innovation. Her debut memoir, The Other Side of Absence, is an elegant story of resilience and strength, and of a daughter reconciling the damage that families inherit from war. Betty, I'm so excited you could join us today. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my great pleasure, and welcome to everybody. It's so lovely to see so many faces, and I'm really looking forward to giving this talk today. And I imagine that some of you have an interest in history and the period of World War II and maybe the concentration camps and the Cold War or maybe post-war immigration to Australia. And perhaps some of you also have family stories that relate to this period of time. Some of you may have been researching your own family histories and lost relatives and uncovering secrets, lies and mysteries as I did. For me, it turned out to be a bit of a detective story, but I'd like to begin today with a short reading from the opening pages of my book, if that's okay, just to orient us to the story, and then I'll talk a little more about how it all happened. I'm not sure whether any of you have read The Other Side of Absence already, but for those of you who haven't, let me reassure you I won't reveal any spoilers. So you can start the book afresh if you like. So from the beginning. In Search of the Truth, 21st of November 2013. 70 years after my father's arrest by the Gestapo for his part in the World War II Polish resistance, in a city where I didn't speak the language or know anyone, I was looking for the truth about my dead father. With a large bunch of keys in my hand, I worked my way through the 5 locks on the front door until finally I was able to push it open. I reached around the door jamb and fumbled for the light switch. Flick, 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 nothing. No lights, but the central heating was working. And then on that cold November day, it was warm inside, uncomfortably warm. I left the front door open to let in some light. But even so, being in that forsaken apartment in Poland made me uneasy, an uninvited intruder into my father's secret life, even though the past inhabitants were long dead. Part of me was already heading for the door. Part of me was desperate to know more. It had all started 3 years earlier on a 2-week writing retreat. The writing prompt on day 1 had been to complete the sentence, "The first time I met," and write for 20 minutes. I wrote the phrase in my notebook and was surprised by what followed. The first time I met my father, I was 19. I hadn't thought about him for years, deliberately. I continued to write, recounting the details of that first meeting, his short, heavy build, his strong Polish accent, how I'd felt, expecting a jolt of connection, like an electrical cord plugged back into its source, alive with knowing. But it hadn't been like that at all. The plan on the retreat was to add more to this story each day, but I soon realised I knew very little about him. Mum hadn't been much help over the years. Her mantra had always been, no postmortems, no point in looking back. Long buried questions wormed their way to the surface. Who was this Polish man who was my father? Antoni Jagielski, or Tony, as my mother always called him. He wasn't Jewish, so why had he been sent to Auschwitz? How had he survived? Why did he come to Australia? And most of all, why did he desert us, turn up briefly when I was 19, and then disappear again? So those questions that sort of came to the fore in that writing course were really the ones that I then embarked on, quite a long process of research and discovery to find the answers to. They'd been running around in my head for a long time, and they began to demand some answers. So who was this man, Anthony Yagelski, who was my father, and what had driven him to make the decisions that he made? Up until the writing course prompted my investigations, this is what I knew. So I'll share with you where I was up to when I began this search. So my parents met and married in London. My mother was an Australian, and I was born in London, but their journeys to London were really very different. So my mother, this is me and as a baby with my father holding me. It's the only photo I have of my father and I together. And look at how formally he's dressed in his suit, sitting in the park on a rug. It's rather strange these days, I think. So my mother, she went to England from Australia on a working holiday. It was quite adventurous for her at the time. She was a bit of a pioneer herself. She was only 21 when she went, and she went by herself. And working holidays really weren't all that common in those days, as you'll be able to appreciate. But that's how she got there, and she'd planned to go for 2 years and then to come back to Australia. My father's journey to London was a little bit longer and much more difficult than Mum's journey on the ship. He had been a resistance fighter in Poland, so he lived in Lublin in the east of Poland, and he had then been arrested as a resistance fighter for his activities and was taken to the Lublin Castle jail initially, and then he was sent to Auschwitz. And he was there for some months, for 6 months, and then he was sent to Gusen concentration camp, which is in Austria. It's part of the Mauthausen complex of concentration camps that were in Austria. He was still there at the end of the war, and then after the war, he spent some time in Linz recovering, and then he made his way to Italy to join what was left of the Polish troops in Italy. And he was then shipped to England, and that's how he ended up in London. So he couldn't return to Poland after the war. So although he had fought, on the side of the Allies at the end of the war, for those of you that know your World War II history, so Poland was given to the Russians at the end of the war, and even though it was what had begun the war, that fight for democracy for Poland, it was denied them at the end of the war, even though the Allies won. So any of the, there were lots of stories, I found this out later, many stories of resistance fighters who had been imprisoned, who had returned to Poland, who were either executed by the Soviet regime or were sent to the Russian gulags or were imprisoned. So returning to Poland wasn't really much of an option. So that was why he ended up in London and had, as I said, had joined what was left of the Polish army and was first of all to Southampton and then to Amesbury and ended up in Tilbury. So Mum and I, we returned to Australia in 1954. So we went on the ship. My father's visa had been delayed somewhat. So Mum and I came on our own. That was always Mum's plan to come back to Australia. And we lived with my grandmother in Lismore, which is up on the north coast of New South Wales. And 6 months later, my father arrived. I can't imagine what he thought Australia was going to be like. I can't imagine how he thought about what his life was actually going to be like. That's just really hard to imagine for me, this small country town that really knew very little of World War II even, let alone all of the atrocities that happened and the sort of things that he had been through. But after a couple of weeks, he didn't stay with us for very long. My mother woke up one morning and he had disappeared and she didn't hear from him again. So she was then a single mother in the late 50s and early 60s. And to find some work and accommodation. She took a live-in job at a hotel, first of all in Kyogle, and then moved to Coffs Harbour. Children couldn't live in the hotel, so I was fostered out to a number of different families between the ages of 2 and 9 when I went to boarding school, and I would see mum from time to time, but not really very often. In 1961, mum filed for a divorce. She was turning 30, so she was a young mother. She was turning 30, and somebody had said to her, "Why don't you clean things up and give yourself a birthday present and, sort all of this out?" So she filed for divorce on the grounds of desertion, which is what you did in those days. Only to find out that my father was a bigamist. He was already married, and his wife was still alive, and he had another daughter alive in Poland. So their marriage was annulled, and mum, continued as a single parent. My father stayed in Australia, and this is a photo of him in the 1960s in Sydney, in some street in Sydney. And in 1974, as I said at the beginning from that reading, he contacted us, and I met him when I was 19. And it was a really difficult time. He was very badly damaged by the war, not only physically, but also psychologically. And it wasn't an easy time for me. He showed me a photo of my half-sister, Yanina, who looked quite like me, I have to say, but, much older. And he told me that she had 2 sons. In 1974, that same year, later that year, he returned to Poland. And that was really, I found out later, that was really always his aim, to go back to Poland. And he thought he was dying, and that was where he wanted to be buried. And Mum and I never heard from him or saw him again. So a long way from where he had come from, but this is sort of a little map of his journey from Lublin to London, and then to Lismore, and then all the L's, and then back to Lublin again. From time to time over the years, I did wonder about him, but I had no real desire to find out what had happened to him until the writing course. And I began to look for traces of what had happened to him. And that writing course was in 2010, so that's 10 years ago. But I had no luck, really. And then my mother died in 2011, and I found a suitcase with photos and letters of my father, the letters that he had written to me when I met him in Sydney in 1974 when I was 19. I had read those letters, but she'd kept them all of those years. And I began to search again the following year, and I got serious in 2013, and I planned to go to Poland in November of 2013 during the summer break from UTS. So I teach at the University of Technology in Sydney, so those summer holidays, which were winter in Poland, unfortunately, I decided that I would take that time and travel and see if I could follow in my father's footsteps to see what I could find out about his life and about the decisions that he had made. So for those of you interested in the research side of things, which can be a bit tricky, looking at family history, and you can find yourself up very late at night, I can tell you, for anybody who's been looking, you'll find that. And for those of you that haven't, that might be tempted to, I would really urge you to. It's a pretty exciting journey for most of the time. So these were the discoveries prior to my planned trip in November to Poland. So in March, I started with a genealogy research. So I went to the Society of Australian Genealogists to get some help. Ancestry.com, which, from all the ads you think has every person on there, didn't have a thing about my father. So then I was pointed in the direction of FamilySearch.org. And I found that he was one of 8 children. I hadn't really thought about him having brothers and sisters, but, of course, why not? But there was no death certificate for him, and there was no sign of Yanina or her sons that my father had told me about. So I kept looking for months, and I wasn't getting anywhere. So I had written to places in Poland and got no response. And then I was put in touch with Christina Druzniak from Lost History. So she's a historian, and she specialises in Polish language and histories and helping people find their families. for various reasons. And she was able to, it was, without her, I just wouldn't have even gone to Poland. Well, I probably would have gone, but I wouldn't have found anything. And this story would never really have evolved. So she was able to write in Polish. She was able to ring various places. And that just made, an enormous difference, of course. And then I received my father's death certificate, and I found that he had died in 1996. So he'd gone back to Poland to die and lived for another 22 years, which was, pretty amazing. And given that he was born in 1909, he was 20 years older than my mother. So being born in 1909 means that he was a child during World War I. He lived in Poland between the wars, and then, he was an active resistance fighter during World War II. So, I mean, he'd had quite a life and lived until 1996. So he was 87 when he died. And the name on the death certificate who had been notified by, I thought, well, perhaps this is my half-sister. Maybe it's Janina's husband who had notified of the death. So I was thinking, maybe we'd be able to follow along those lines. I then found out where he was buried in Lipova Street, which was just opposite where he had lived. So his address was on the death certificate as well. And I also found his first wife's death certificate, and she had died in 2003, many years after he had died, but they were buried together. So I then realised that my father had actually gone back to live with his first wife after 33 years. So his first wife and his daughter Janina hadn't seen him for 33 years, not since he was arrested in the middle of the night by the Gestapo and sent to Auschwitz. And I just couldn't believe that, that would happen. But anyway, it did. So then I had a brace yourself email from Christina, who had been, searching, and often because of the time difference, I'd wake up in the morning and I'd reach for my phone to see what Christina had found overnight. And I had this brace yourself email from her, which said Janina, she had found Janina, but Janina had died alone in December 2011, so 2 years before I'd begun to search, and that she had no children. So I was absolutely devastated to not only that she had died, but also that she had no children. And I thought, well, in that case, there's no more family. There were no other brothers and sisters. There were no other relatives that I had found that were alive. So I then thought, well, should I go to Poland? Should I just give up now? Is that the end of my family story? But I had a very strong urge to go to Poland, and I'm so glad that I did. What I actually found when I got there, within a few days of arriving, I actually inherited the apartment that my father had returned to live in with my half-sister and his other wife. And since Janina had died in 2011, that apartment had been locked up. And so I was wondering whether I would be able to actually get some documents or some photos out of that apartment. But as it turned out, I actually inherited the apartment and all of its contents, which was like, just this time capsule from all of these years. And honestly, they hadn't thrown out a thing for, decades. And it was full of photos and documents, which was quite amazing. So I'm just going to read you another short piece, if that's okay, from when the day that I arrived that I actually got the keys to the apartment, just to give you some sense of what this very unexpected inheritance felt like. So Thursday, the 21st of November, Keys, Locks and Ghosts, this chapter's called. Apartment 21, 14 Lipova Street, Lublin, Poland. Today was the day. I would open the door to a world that hadn't existed for me until 3 months ago. I had no idea what to expect. I felt the 2 sets of keys cold in my hand, 6 keys on each ring. These were the keys I had collected from the caretaker's office after handing over my inheritance certificate. I sat in the taxi on the way back to Lipova Street, trying to imagine my father, my half-sister and her mother holding these keys in the palms of their hands, between their thumbs and forefingers. inserting them into locks, opening doors. They had used these same keys day after day, locking, unlocking, opening and closing parts of their lives, as my father had closed the door on his life in Australia and reopened his Polish life. What they revealed and what they hid was closely controlled. In the resistance, in Auschwitz, in Mauthausen, in England, and in Australia, keys, locks, secrets, lies, and silences had been the strategies for survival, and I assumed some form of sanity. I paid the taxi driver and stepped onto the pavement outside Lublin Plaza, across the road from number 14. Now that I had everything I needed, I didn't feel ready. I'd come all this way hoping to find a photograph or a document that would show me something of my father's life and the life of my half-sister. But now I feared that there might be too much, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. It was the same tension I had felt for years, wanting to know but uneasy about what I might find. I layered up with coat, scarf, hat and gloves and crossed the street to the block of apartments. Up 2 flights of stairs and I was standing in front of number 21. A tattered striped towel, like a faded licorice allsort, was wrapped around a black rubber mat. I straightened it with my foot and stared at the painted and scratched front door. There were 5 keyholes. I carefully matched key to lock and eventually managed to open the door. It smelt like sweet pink musk sticks mixed with wet clay. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I could see a small hallway to the left and straight ahead a surprisingly tidy room. In its centre, a round dining table with a white lace tablecloth and a vase of faded red plastic poinsettias. I felt for the light switch. No power, of course. The energy had long gone from this room, its last inhabitant having departed 2 years ago. I stood immobilised for a while, not sure of going forward, not sure of going back. The early afternoon light filtered through the once white net curtains drawn across the corner windows, hanging full length behind a dressing table with a tall central mirror. I took slow, small steps towards the window, feeling nervous, like a house invader about to be sprung. Something on the dressing table caught my eye. There sat a strip of 3 black and white, passport-sized photos of a man in a striped jacket. In one photo, he was wearing a striped cap. In the other 2, he had a shaved head. 2 were looking at the camera, the other a profile shot. Was this my father? I met him when he was 65 years old, and the only earlier photo I had seen of him was the wedding photo with my mother in 1953. In the corner of this photo, it said, KL Auschwitz, 23522. My father's number in the concentration camp. It was him. At that moment, something shifted in me. The lens through which I viewed him changed. I looked into his eyes, willing some sort of story, some explanation, some understanding. This was day 1 of your 4 years in a concentration camp. How on earth did you survive? And I spent the next months, years, trying to answer that question and finding out what had actually happened. Here's a couple of photos of me in the apartment. So this is the apartment that I walked into. Look, dead pot plants that have been there for 2 years, poor things. That's the dressing table where the photos were on there. And this is the photo that I found. So this is my father's ID photo, and you can see in the corner his number and Auschwitz. There was so much stuff in this apartment, and this is me sitting on the floor trying to sort through. I was thinking about it as an archive, you go to the archives in a library when you're doing research. So I sort of treated this apartment as an archive and started to categorize and put into piles photos and so on. And this is what the cupboards were like. They were just chock-a-block, full of all sorts of things. A lot of it was rubbish, but I just had to be quite meticulous because you know, sometimes I'd throw something towards the bin and something would fall out that was, you know, really quite significant. So one of the things that fell out were this packet of letters. So I don't know how many of you remember these blue aerograms. So this was a 10-penny stamp on there, an aerogram that was sent to Helena, my father's first wife. And there were lots of these packets of letters that he had written to them. So he'd been writing to his first wife, Helena, and his other daughter since he was in England. So the first letter I found was from 1947. And there were lots of photos as well. This is the photo on the front cover of my book. This is my father in Lublin in 1937. This is him and his wife. This big photo was up on the wall in the apartment. So again, back from 1937, a photo of Yanina, my half-sister. You can see the square face, we look the same. It's very, very similar, very Polish. And then also, you know, this is a photo from 1946 that was in the apartment that when my father had returned to the quarry where he'd worked as a prisoner in the Gusen concentration camp for 3 years. So in actual fact, a lot of the documents and photos that I'd hoped to find in the archives in travelling to other places were there sitting in a folder, almost waiting for me really to find them, which was great. I also went to the archives in Auschwitz, found my father's original personal record card, and the Germans were great at keeping records, very meticulous. So there's lots of information on there that I found really helpful. And also I went to the Bata estate where he worked in the shoe factory there. I don't know, did anybody ever have Bata school shoes? I did. And so the Bata shoe factory was where he was working when my mother met him. And this is a short story that talks about him about to leave the Bata shoe factory. And this was in their local, in the Bata news, the paper that they had there. And I also went to the Polish Underground Movement Study Trust in London and the Polish Institute in London as well, and they all had files on my father. But of course, all of these documents that I found were in Polish, so I had to patiently or actually impatiently wait for the letters to be translated and these documents to be translated as well. And I had put an ad in the local paper to see if I could find any other relatives that might be around in Lublin, but I'd had no response. But just before I went to I left Poland in February of 2014, I went looking for the grave of my grandmother. So my middle name is Maria. I was named after her. That was the name my father gave me from her mother, his mother. And I went looking for her grave. And eventually I did find it. So this is in the snow, and I had to bury, this is me, literally digging for my grandmother and my family history. So I had to borrow a shovel and shovel the snow off the top of the grave. There was a metal plaque at the top that actually had her name on it. And underneath that snow, which again was a real shock for me, there were fresh flowers. So it meant that somebody knew her, somebody cared about her, and somebody had recently left flowers on the grave. So I left a note. I got my translator to translate a note to say who I was and what I was looking for and how I could be contacted, because I was just about to go back to Australia. And we had it laminated and we hung it on that little plaque at the top of the grave. And I'll leave you to read the book to find out what happened next. So I think just finally, I'd like to sort of say that the rest of the book covers my search for the answer to those original questions that I had about the camps of Auschwitz and Gusen, and back to Lublin again. And also I went back to Poland and to Austria a second time. And I went in 2014 for the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the concentration camps in 2015. For the liberation of the concentration camps of World War II. And I was able to talk to some of the Gusen survivors and also to their families, which was a very moving experience, I have to say. It was really quite a poignant moment to be welcomed into this family of children of survivors of concentration camps from the war. And it really was quite amazing, and I'm still in touch with some of them now. I'll leave you to read about some of those extraordinary discoveries that I made. Some of them were disturbing, but also some of them were delightful and very memorable for me. So just to finish off before we go to questions, I want to say how fortunate I was to have met amazing people along the way. And two of the amazing people were my interpreters and translators. So this is Chris in the middle, who you'll get to know very well in the book. And Agnieszka, who sort of took over from him later. So both university students, and they were amazing in terms of supporting and helping me. And there were many other people. I met the man, Zhisław, whose name was on my father's death certificate. He was the one that I really went to Poland to meet. He knew my father. He was the only person that I knew at that stage before I left Australia who had known my father. So I was keen to meet him and find out what he knew as well. So I think I'll leave it there. And just to say that it's been a hell of a journey, I can tell you that much. And I now really feel at peace with my father's story and the decisions that he made. Yeah, and I would encourage anybody to look for their family stories and to write them up as well, because they're important parts of our own histories. And I think that, like me, you might find that, things that shaped your parents and grandparents and so on have shaped you as well. And I think it's an interesting avenue to have a look at. So thank you very much. And any comments or questions? You can also, if you'd like me to sign a book and send it to you, you can order one through my website. And also just to say that the work that I did with the Society of Australian Genealogists, we're now running an online writing family history introductory workshop. There's going to be 4 of them through the year. The first one's on the 18th of March. So you can also find the link to that on my website as well. So if you're interested in writing up your family history, I hope you might be, then we'll be just running a one-day introduction to how you might go about that. So I hope that you might be inspired to do so.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Betty. That was absolutely fascinating. And I must say it was interesting when you were saying that a lot of us grew up wearing barter shoes. I will say down here, we definitely did, because we actually have a barter factory in Mornington. So we have grown up driving past the barter factory multiple times. I'll probably see it this afternoon. So I think definitely in primary school, most of us would have gone to the barter shoe factory to get our school shoes or our gumboots. So it's not quite, I must say the style here is much more practical than perhaps Spain or somewhere like that. I've seen shoes come from Spain that are barter and I go, why can't we make those in Mornington? But yeah, ours are very practical work shoes, school shoes, sandals, those sorts of things. So I did feel that when I was reading the book, I suddenly felt we had a slight connection to a little part of your history, which was lovely.
Oh, good, yes.
Now, are you all right if I stop your sharing?
Of course, yes.
Beautiful, that's easy. Now, as we said earlier, if you do you have a question for Betty at all, please pop it in the chat box there. Now, I must say there was so much research involved in getting your story to where it was, and we were discussing off air that it was a 10-year process. What was that process like for you? Do you think the research alone perhaps wore you down at times? How did you cope with the things that you were unraveling as you went?
Look, I think that anybody who looks into their family history and starts to do that research should be prepared to find information that they may be unaware of, that might be shocking, that might be disturbing in some way. And particularly if you've got, secrets in your family, they've been secrets for a reason. And sometimes, of course, you find that those secrets that, in the 50s or, earlier, that were really on topics of unwed mothers and things that really don't bother us very much these days. But, so sometimes there are those things that are uncovered. And for anybody who has been adopted to, look back into finding their birth parents, that can be quite difficult, and it can also be very exciting. So there's lots of mixed emotions. And I guess for me, over such a long period of looking for information, when I actually went to Poland, I think that was really, I had 3 months there. So I went in November and I was there December and January and came home early February. And that was 3 months of, winter and not knowing anybody and not speaking the language. And but I just tried to be disciplined and just, get on with the research as well as, meeting people and so on as I did. But I think that when I came back, I actually fell into a bit of a heap afterwards. It had been a long time to sort of hold that together and to be on my own. And I went and got some help. So, I think, knowing that there are many resources available for support if you need it. I think that's a good way to start on this sort of a journey as well, knowing that if you need some help, who would you call on? So what friends? I mean, I used to, Skype my friends and my family. I have 2 children. So I'd Skype them from Poland and, have a quick sanity check and a bit of a chat. But I think that, you do find things that sometimes are very surprising and sometimes in a delightful way. And sometimes, as I said, it can be a bit disturbing as well. But I just have this a bit of a terrier instinct, I think. You'd find a bit, and it was so exciting. You'd want to find the next bit and the next bit and the next bit, and looking for those links and keeping track of that research was sometimes a bit tricky. But and especially when it's in another language, and I was going to various institutions and organisations and birth deaths and marriages, and just looking for certificates and the documents that might prove things and provide evidence for what I was looking for. So it was a roller coaster ride, that's for sure.
I did find it fascinating in the beginning when you were talking about your research process versus getting a bit of help in, and the difference that made once you were connected to people who could speak fluent Polish and they just knew those nuances of bureaucracy in Poland, and that just by asking you get it, but if you don't know to ask, you don't get it.
No, well, that's right. So, my father's birth certificate, I went to the Polish consulate in Sydney, and, I waited for months and months, and, because I didn't know when he died. So, they sort of came to me and said, what, you want us to look through, 30 years or whatever and to find a death certificate? And I said, well, yes, I do, actually. And but that took a long time. And when it did arrive, it didn't have a lot of information on it. So when I showed it to Christina, she said, oh, no, we can get much more than that. So, that's exactly what you're talking about, Marnie, there, that she knew that there was more information that was available. And the International Tracing Service at Bad Arolsen in Germany as well, they have massive files on people. And I didn't need to go there in the end because my father had gathered all of these documents. So I was fortunate in that case. But, she was saying that she'd had lots of people who, had made inquiries to them. And you wait, because there are, I can't remember, but, there are tens of thousands of people who make inquiries every month about, relatives who've gone missing or that they want to find history about. So they're just overwhelmed with, but there's a big interest in genealogy and in family histories these days. So, they get a bit overwhelmed for sure. But look, it certainly is an interesting process. And I just have had so many synchronicities that I just have felt like I'm really on the right path. I'll reach a barrier or a stumbling block, and then, I'll think, all right, not that path. There's another rabbit hole somewhere, and I'll just keep going. And then all of a sudden, someone will turn up and say, I know this woman in Melbourne, Christina Krasniak, who, she might be able to help you. Why don't you contact her? Here's her email address. So, that then opens up a whole new way of going about things. So, yeah. I was
going to say just before, I just imagined you just going down the rabbit hole and coming up and going, oh, it's 5 a.m. Like it's just, because you're just so focused on what you're doing and following it along, or you follow it and it's a dead end. And I just can't imagine the emotions you would have gone through throughout those months that you were researching it. But I have to say, I really loved your title, The Other Side of Absence. Was it always your working title, or is it something that came a little bit later?
No, it came a little bit late, well, quite a bit later actually, but when I got to the publishing stage. So I think I'd called it Finding My Absent Father
Okay.
at one stage, but it wasn't really about finding him, the person. I knew that he would be dead by the time I got to Poland, and by the time I started looking, I knew he would well and truly be dead, given that he was born in 1909. And I was thinking about, well, the whole journey for me actually put me on the other side of it. I guess I'd always thought about, having an absent father and missing having a father in my life. And, all the other kids at school had fathers, and, thinking that I'd really missed out. And, but in fact, I think I found from, the research that I did that I think the other title I had at one stage was The Blessing of Absence. But that sounded a bit too religious. So
Yeah.
we ditched that one, but it was a blessing, as it turned out. My
Yeah.
father was a very damaged man. And for anybody who's read Magda Szubanski's Reckoning, they'll know that, her experience with her father was very different. Her father was able to hold a family together, and he did talk one day with her about, he said, I'll tell you today about what happened to me, and then I never want to talk about it again. And of course, that was the experience of lots of people, and lots of, parents and grandparents who had experiences of the war were very traumatized, which, is understandable. But I don't think we had a very good understanding of trauma when those people returned from the war. Or, in fact, the long tail of war, I think, is something that we don't realize, and that it doesn't just affect the men and women who go to war, but it affects their families when they return, and for generations to follow. The trauma gets passed on. There's a whole field around epigenetics, around that, DNA and what happens with those traumas being passed through the generations. But there's also, that lived experience that people have of living with, parents and grandparents who have suffered trauma. And I think we're better at dealing with it these days because there's an understanding of it. But even so, we ask people to go and do terrible things, things that they'd be locked up for if they did them in our, in everyday life. And yet, it's what we ask them to do, and then come back and expect them just to come back and be a, normal family person again.
Yeah, reacquaint themselves.
Yeah, it's a big ask for sure. And especially for, all of those migrants who came after the war, who were so traumatized and had to, they were refugees, either political refugees like my father was, or, different types of asylum seekers. And it still happens today. People, fleeing from war-torn countries because they can't return.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I've spoken to a couple of authors who have experiences after Vietnam War. And it's very much the same. It's about a long preparation to head into war and a couple of days decompression. And I think we need to be doing a lot more for our soldiers, our returned soldiers. Absolutely. It just, the flow-on effects for families, as you rightly said, we are understanding that a lot better now. And I think a lot more is being done. But hopefully we can only improve again.
Yes, well, that's right. And I think, hopefully we can find another way, rather than war, to settle differences. You would just, I have a grandson now, and I can imagine, him asking me about, well, what do you do, if you can't sort of, come to some agreement? Oh, well, you just shoot them,
Yeah.
It's, basically what we do.
Kind of what we're saying.
It's very simplistic, but, it's just,
I am keen to know, though, through that research process, were you finding yourself writing along the way as part of that? Or did you really have to find it, put it in order, get it straight in your head, and then get it down on paper? How did you use that your writing process along the way?
Look, it's a good question, because I'm just starting on my next book and research for that, and just sort of grappling with that. Do I just do all of this research and then write, or will I write as I'm going along? But so for this first book, I did start to write first of all, actually. So before I went to Poland in 2013, so that writing class was really the beginning of it. And so I thought, well, I'll write what I know already. And I wrote quite a lot about my mum, because I didn't really know very much about my father, and my mother had died by the time I started to write. But there were lots of bits and pieces that I could sort of put together from her life, and then I ran out of material, and so I actually stopped writing and then researched really heavily before I went to Poland in 2013. And then once I was there, I sort of thought on the trip over, I got myself a journal, and I thought I'm going to write every day because I'll forget a lot of things that happen. And so I was really journaling each day and making notes of documents and evidence that I was gathering along the way. So I had a sort of a research plan and things that I was collecting, and then I had the writing that I was doing about my own experience of it and how it felt, and my own discoveries as I was going along, and what was exciting and what wasn't, and how I was feeling along the way. So it was a bit of a mix, really. And then when I came back to Australia, as I said, I needed some help initially, and I needed to step back from it for a little while, because I also got some of the documents that had been translated, and that was a bit disturbing as well. So I just had to step back from a bit. And so I did put it aside for a short while, and then I thought, now I've got to come back and get on with the writing, which is what I did. But it took some time.
Yeah, and I know you have contributed to some journals. Did you feel, what learnings have you taken from writing your memoir over that decade into your next piece of work?
That's a really good question, because I'm just reflecting on that, as we speak, really. In this last week or so, I've been just sort of thinking about that. So I'm actually going to write about the O'Neill side of my family, so my mother's family. And as we were talking, just before we came on, my great-grandfather and his brother and brother-in-law settled and pioneered the area out the back of Coffs Harbour, up on the north coast of New South Wales, the area of Karangi and Arara. And of course, in settling that area, they unsettled the Indigenous population. So now I'll go up there at the end of this month and spend a week up there. I live in Sydney, so I'll head up there, and I've made some contacts with some of the Indigenous elders, and I'm hoping that they will have some stories that they can pass on. So I do like to sort of immerse myself. And I think that experience from going to Poland was 3 months of just being there. And travelling to the other, to Austria, to the concentration camps there as well. But I think that's, for me, what I need to do is to immerse myself in it as much as possible, and to take notes along the way. And I'm just starting to do a bit of writing. And then sometimes I sort of get to a point where I actually need to do some research, so I don't have anything else to write at the moment. So yeah, it's a bit of a mixed process. And I think you just have to go with what works for you, for other people who are thinking about writing as well.
Absolutely. And I will say, your book is so well written. I found it very easy to read. I'm quite often, when it comes to nonfiction, quite often I'll find myself reading a page or two and then having to skip back and reread because I've just skimmed over a couple of paragraphs. I'm finding with yours that I'm actually with you along the way. I'm not having to reread. I'm understanding who we're talking about. So well done. It's actually a very nice, pleasant read, even though the subject material is sometimes confronting.
Oh, thank you for that. And I hope I can do as good a job with the next one as well. And I'm sort of thinking, will I just take people along with me again on the journey, or will I write it in a different way? So I'm not quite sure how the form of it will be, but I know there's some other themes that are emerging as well around homelessness, for example, and what an important issue that is currently, and particularly for older women. But there are all sorts of different types of homelessness, and so I've had a couple of experiences of homelessness myself. So I'm going to I think I'll have that as the spine of it, but other people's stories as well, and see what comes up with the Indigenous history. And who knows where. This is the exciting part about writing. You never know where you're going to end up. So
that's it. And I do find that fascinating, because I know in my work with the Country Women's Association, in the last few years, we've been working a lot on homelessness for older women, because it's a very real thing.
Well, it's the largest growing cohort of people who are
Mm,
experiencing homelessness,
absolutely.
and different. People think of homelessness often as those that are rough sleepers, people who are sleeping on the streets. But there are many forms of homelessness, and really, the definition around it is around having safe and secure housing. And so, lots of older women, don't have that safety, and they don't have security. They might be renting, they might be living in a camper van, they might be sleeping in their cars, they might be couch surfing with friends or with family, but it's temporary. And so, there are lots of different forms of it, and I'm gathering stories as I'm going to incorporate. So, yeah, that's a bit exciting as well and interesting.
Well, if I can have any say over the next book, I think a lot of people, we have at Frankston City, we have a lot of people very much interested in researching their family history. And I feel that this book, by taking us on the journey, we've almost learned a process along the way. And it's like you've allowed many people to jump a queue, if you like, rather than having to experience it themselves. They're going, right, I think that's what I need to do. I'll go straight to here. And I've missed this 6 months of sort of swimming around or treading water, if you like. So I actually quite enjoyed that. And I felt I learned a lot personally through that process. What is your advice to anyone who feels they do have a story that they'd like to tell who might be watching this today?
Yeah, well, I guess there are those two parts of it. There's the research part to make sure that you've got your facts right, and that and well, if you actually want to write it as nonfiction, so I think first of all, I would be thinking, if you're wanting to write your family history, then I think one of the first questions you'd want to think about is, why do I want to do that, and who's it for? Who am I actually writing for? Is it just for me? Is it for my family? Is it, for the generations to come? So there's some documentation and record of it. Is it for a broader audience? Do you want to use your family history as a catalyst for writing historical fiction? There are many, many different genres that you can write in. And then, of course, there are all of the sort of writing tips and ways of writing that are going to make it a story that other people will want to read. So thinking about the narrative arc of the story, thinking about the characters, what will have people turning pages, what will keep them reading, because you don't just want a list of events. That's not what you want to write. I mean, sure, you can do that. And that might be, one of your early processes is to actually construct a timeline of some sort and a family tree, so that you've got those two documents that can help guide you along the way. Not to say that you have to write your family history in a strictly linear sense, and just thinking about the creative process in it, which is the fun part of it as well. How do I make this interesting, and what creative aspects of writing can I bring into it, like involving the senses, and how do we put people in a place so that they can actually feel what it was like maybe to live in those times. And our family histories are more than, as I said, just the events. It's not just the births, deaths and marriages that happen and who was in the family, but it's also about the social context, and what was it like for women or children in those days, or what was it like for animals and the environment. I mean, there are so many different aspects that you can bring in to paint a really rich picture of your family and the experiences that they might have had. So it's a great thing to do. But come along and do our workshop, our Introduction to Writing Family History, if you're interested, because I think it'll be fun, and I think that anybody who's thinking about doing that would enjoy it. And there'll be lots of tips around the research part of it as well as the writing of it as well. So I think there are those two aspects.
I think it's always good to seek out things like the writing workshop to just get you started and be around like-minded people who are working on similar things. I know in my own writing club, I find the same thing. I'm inspired just because people around me are writing, and really keep me on the straight and narrow. Now, tell me, what do you hope that readers will take away from The Other Side of Absence?
Look, apart from, or in addition to hopefully encouraging others to think about their family histories in this way, I think, some of the themes for me that have come through is really about understanding the damage that war does, and really having an understanding of, what we do to humans that are, well-intentioned and so on, when we send people to war, and the impact of that, and, when people return from war. And I think, just understanding that those experiences are very hard for people to talk about, and anybody who has suffered any trauma, whether it's from war or childhood sexual abuse or whatever it might be. And I was so thrilled to see our 4 Australians of the year, all women and all talking about really important matters. So I think, giving a voice to these important themes, and whatever's in your family history, you may well be able to do the same thing. But I hope that people will take courage and be inspired, and not only want to read other people's family histories, because what that does is it develops a much better understanding of others. And I think that's what's important in our democracy. We've seen in the States what's happened to democracy and the threat to it. But I think here in Australia, we have a history to understand as well. And I think, having an understanding of both our own personal family histories and the broader histories that, that they are set in, I think that can actually lead to much greater understanding. And what we think of as the democratisation of history as well. It's these personal stories and these contexts in which, the social context which people are set in, and the influences that, cause people to make decisions, and then to see the consequences of those decisions. There are a few things.
I agree. Now, we know you've got your website where people can order a signed copy of your book. So that's bettyoneil.com.au?
No, just .com.
.com. Now, you are on social media as well. So where can people find you?
So I have an Instagram account, which is o'neil.betty, so back to front. I have a Facebook page as well that you'll find easily. And also these books are available in, good bookstores, and also through Booktopia and Book Depository and Amazon as well. And you can get e-versions of them, and so readily available.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Betty. It's been an absolute pleasure learning about your family history, and I'm looking forward to finishing the book this weekend.
Oh, excellent. Oh, look, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me along, and it's been lovely to have people here listening to this, and I hope that, as I said, you'll be encouraged not only to read my family story, but also delve a bit further into your own as well if you haven't.
Well, I look forward to reading the second book when that comes along. So hopefully we can have you back with that one as well. That would be lovely.
That would be fabulous. Thank you so much, Marnie, and thanks everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. The Other Side of Absence is available to pop on reserve via the Frankston City Library's website. If you're not a member, you can sign up straight away via the library website. And I think we've got a few reserves on that copy at the moment. But as Betty said, you can also purchase The Other Side of Absence I'm losing my words today, directly from Betty's website. And I'll include a purchase link when we share this recording across our social media channels. Keep an eye on the Frankston City Library's website for the great Frank Talks we have coming up. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Frank Talk with Betty O'Neill for Frankston City Libraries.